Hello and welcome to today's video, where we're going to dive into a fascinating topic that spans history, philosophy, and some very modern questions about power and morality. We're focusing on a saying widely attributed to Niccolò Machiavelli: "Never attempt to win by force what can be won by deception." Although this exact phrase may not appear verbatim in his classic works, it succinctly captures the spirit of his strategic advice and has resonated through centuries of political and strategic thinking. In this narrative, we'll explore who Machiavelli was, the tumultuous world he lived in, and why his ideas on power and deception have sparked both admiration and controversy. We'll also see how his perspective has been mirrored by other great strategists such as Sun Tzu, and how these principles continue to find expression in our contemporary society, whether in the boardrooms of large corporations or the digital battlefields of cyberspace. By taking this deep dive, we aim to show that Machiavelli's old wisdom still resonates in our modern world, reminding us that cunning and strategy can sometimes outmaneuver raw strength. So get comfortable and join me on this journey. This will be a story that loops back and forth in time, picking out intriguing anecdotes from history, classical philosophy, and the digital age. It's a tale of what it truly means to aim for victory, not just on the battlefield, but in all walks of life. Imagine living in Renaissance Italy, a time of flourishing art, scientific breakthroughs, and intense political intrigue. It's the early 16th century, and Italy is not a single unified nation as it is today. Instead, it's a patchwork of rival city-states, each with its own rulers and forms of governance. Florentine statesmen, Venetian doges, Milanese dukes, papal armies, and French or Spanish interests all weave in and out of alliances, betrayals, and battles. Amidst this swirl of power struggle stands Niccolò Machiavelli, a man with deep insight into the mechanics of political power. Born in Florence in 1469, Machiavelli served as a diplomat, a political thinker, and eventually a writer. Much of his life was influenced by the shifting alliances and the precarious balance of power in his homeland. Florence, once under the firm hand of the Medici family, experienced periods of Republican government and then Medici rule once more. Machiavelli himself fell in and out of political favor, at times working closely with influential figures and at other times facing exile or suspicion. It was in 1513, during a period of relative isolation and reflection, that Machiavelli wrote The Prince. This short treatise was meant as a guidebook, a kind of manual to teach leaders how to gain and maintain political power in a world rife with danger and deceit. Within this text, Machiavelli urges rulers to be cunning, strategic, and even morally flexible if that's what it takes to protect their state and themselves. Because of this, Machiavelli's name has sometimes become synonymous with manipulation and ruthlessness. However, many scholars argue that Machiavelli was not necessarily endorsing tyranny or immorality as an absolute. Instead, he might have been simply describing politics as it was practiced in his time, suggesting that an effective ruler must be prepared to do what circumstances demand. The phrase, "never attempt to win by force what can be won by deception," captures the essence of one of his common themes. It's often easier, less costly, and more sustainable to triumph by outsmarting one's foes instead of trying to overwhelm them with brute strength. Now let's step into the heart of the matter. At first glance, "never attempt to win by force what can be won by deception" suggests a somewhat cynical view of human interaction. Deception, for many of us, has negative connotations: lying, scheming, tricking others. Force, while often violent, at least has a sort of directness to it, like a blunt instrument that everyone can see coming. Yet Machiavelli's perspective is more nuanced than a simple endorsement of lying. In The Prince, Machiavelli argues that a ruler, or a prince as he calls it, should be like a fox and a lion. The fox represents cunning, subtlety, and the ability to recognize traps. The lion stands for brute force, physical might, and intimidation. Machiavelli believed that a successful ruler needs both, but crucially he thought that relying too much on force could be more dangerous in the long run. Why? Because force is expensive. It requires large armies, resources, and it risks provoking open rebellion. Deception, by contrast, can achieve the same goal more quietly, at less cost. One of Machiavelli's prime illustrations of deception over force is found in examples he draws from ancient history or in allusions to animals. He famously remarks that a prince should be able to adopt the traits of both the fox and the lion as the situation demands. The lion can scare off wolves, but a fox can avoid traps. If the same objective, victory or control, can be achieved by cunning, the wise ruler may prefer that over a costly confrontation. Yet it's important to remember that Machiavelli isn't necessarily praising deception as an inherently good thing. He's describing a world where others, rivals, potential traitors, foreign armies, are likely to employ deception themselves. In such a dangerous landscape, being naive about cunning or refusing to consider deception could leave a ruler at a severe disadvantage. Machiavelli's advice is about survival and efficacy within this realist approach to politics. If we look back through world history, we see the principle of deception over force in many pivotal moments. Consider the battles of Hannibal, the Carthaginian general who famously crossed the Alps to strike at Rome. Hannibal used cunning strategies to turn the tide in his favor, even when outnumbered. At the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE, Hannibal deployed his forces in such a way as to encircle the Roman legions, who initially thought they had the upper hand. It was a brilliant use of trickery on the battlefield. Victory was won by deception rather than just direct confrontation. Fast forward to more modern conflicts. In World War II, the Allies made extensive use of deception leading up to the D-Day invasions. They fabricated entire phantom armies, used fake radio traffic, and planted misinformation to convince the Axis powers that the landing would occur at Calais rather than Normandy. This cunning approach significantly reduced the resistance the real landing forces faced, saving countless Allied lives. One famous example is Operation Mincemeat, wherein British intelligence used a corpse dressed as an officer and planted misleading documents on him, allowing him to drift ashore where German forces would find him. These documents indicated false invasion plans, leading to a misallocation of German defenses. This was a classic demonstration of Machiavellian thought in practice, success achieved through subterfuge, sparing the Allies a more grueling battle that might have resulted from facing heavier defenses. Even in politics, take for instance Otto von Bismarck in 19th century Prussia. He orchestrated conflicts and treaties with a degree of cunning that sometimes verged on deceptive. Bismarck recognized that forging or dissolving alliances at strategic moments could accomplish more than direct military might alone would. While he wasn't above using force, he understood that a well-placed lie, a leaked document, or a cunning maneuver in negotiations could preserve resources and achieve objectives with fewer risks. Machiavelli's stance on deception has a curious parallel in Chinese military philosophy, particularly in Sun Tzu's The Art of War, composed some 2 millennia before Machiavelli's time. Sun Tzu famously remarked that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Though not identical to Machiavelli's worldview, Sun Tzu places a strong emphasis on harmony, careful planning, and discipline. Both thinkers converge on the idea that intelligence, strategy, and subtlety can yield a more potent result than brute force. In The Art of War, deception is elevated to a core principle of warfare. Sun Tzu encourages generals to create illusions of strength when weak, appear weak when strong, and constantly manipulate the enemy's perceptions. The best victory, according to Sun Tzu, is one where the enemy surrenders or is neutralized without a large, resource-draining battle. This resonates deeply with Machiavelli's principle. Why bash your head against a wall when you can quietly open a side door? Both Machiavelli and Sun Tzu lived in eras of widespread conflict and political turbulence. Both recognize that open confrontation is often the costliest path. If you can feign retreat, sow confusion among your enemies, or position yourself in a way that your opponent gives up without a fight, you've achieved success more efficiently. The difference is that Sun Tzu's text is heavily influenced by Eastern philosophies emphasizing the harmony of the commander's mind with the grand order of things, whereas Machiavelli's is deeply entrenched in the raw realpolitik of Renaissance Italy, where moral or spiritual considerations often took a backseat to survival and domination. One of the reasons Machiavelli's name endures in infamy is the moral question his teachings raise. If we take the phrase, "never attempt to win by force what can be won by deception" to heart, does it mean we justify dishonesty or unethical practices just to achieve our goals? That's a question that has sparked debate for centuries. On one hand, Machiavelli can be seen as a realist, someone describing the often brutal game of power politics the way it was. He lived during a time when wars, betrayals, and backstabbing alliances were the norm rather than the exception. From this perspective, Machiavelli was simply advising leaders to be aware that everyone else might be using deception, so you had better be skilled in it yourself, or risk being outmaneuvered. On the other hand, there's a reason the term Machiavellian came to suggest cunning and unscrupulous manipulation. People read The Prince and concluded that Machiavelli was advocating immoral behavior for the sake of political gain. He was, after all, quite explicit that a ruler should not shy away from cruelty or deceit if that was necessary to safeguard their rule. Critics found this appalling, arguing that Machiavelli's approach undermined moral virtues. Today there's a more nuanced reading of Machiavelli. Many scholars point out that in another work, Discourses on Livy, he praises the virtues of republican government and the role of citizen armies, suggesting that he wasn't purely about moral nihilism. Perhaps his real message is that the world is harsh, and that leaders must be prepared to act harshly if that's the only way to protect their community. From this vantage, never attempt to win by force what can be won by deception is not necessarily the moral stance that trickery is good, but rather the practical stance that open violence is often more destructive and less reliable than cunning. Whether one endorses Machiavelli's outlook or not, the tension between morality and efficacy is central to interpreting his legacy. It's an age-old debate. Is it better to be loved or feared as a ruler? Machiavelli famously answers that it's safer to be feared than loved if you can't manage both. He believed that fear is a more dependable motivator for human behavior than love. In the same vein, he recognized that deception, if successful, is often more reliable in achieving one's goal than the uncertain outcomes of raw military might. It might be easy to assume that Machiavelli's ideas belong to the dusty annals of history, relevant only in the context of Renaissance city-states. But consider how much these principles echo in the modern world. Look at corporate strategies. In a hyper-competitive marketplace, deception can sometimes be a tool, though a controversial one. Marketing campaigns can shade the truth, or a company might mislead its competitors about product launches. Indeed, large corporations today invest massive resources into shaping public perception, controlling the narrative about their brands, and anticipating competitors' moves. Corporate espionage is real, and so is the subtle manipulation of public relations. When there's a large financial gain at stake, it can be argued that some companies or executives prefer cunning over open confrontation or a price war, aligning with Machiavelli's stance that one should avoid wasteful force when a clever tactic might achieve the same or better ends with fewer costs. Politics, especially in democracies, can also reflect this Machiavellian dynamic. Campaign promises might be less about sincerity and more about shaping voter perceptions. Politicians may employ misleading advertising, spin, and carefully orchestrated leaks of information to undermine opponents. This is not unique to any one country. It's evident in political machinery around the world. The emergence of fake news, disinformation campaigns, and social media manipulation can all be understood as modern forms of winning by deception. Technology amplifies these strategies. Cyber warfare often aims to disrupt infrastructure or sow chaos in a rival nation. Again, a form of deception. After all, a government might not want to risk a direct war if it can hack a system or manipulate data to achieve strategic gains without firing a single shot. In the same way, influencing public opinion through social media bots or targeted ads can be seen as another tool of modern deception. The cost is lower, the risks of open confrontation are reduced, and the potential payoff is huge. Exactly the kind of calculation Machiavelli might advise if he were alive today. No strategy is foolproof. While cunning can yield great rewards, it also carries substantial risks. Deception, once discovered, can destroy trust irreparably. If a leader or organization is perceived as manipulative or dishonest, they might face backlash that dwarfs any short-term gain. Machiavelli warns us that while deception may be more efficient, it's also a double-edged sword. If subjects or allies discover that their leader always relies on trickery, they could turn against him. Throughout history, we see examples of this. A government that spreads propaganda might enjoy temporary success, but once the populace realizes they've been lied to, distrust can fuel widespread unrest. Likewise, in corporate environments, if a business is caught deceiving customers, it might face legal penalties, reputational damage, or even bankruptcy. Machiavelli's approach might thus be best understood as a set of pragmatic tools, not a universal moral prescription. He never claimed that deception would always lead to permanent success, only that it can be preferable to brute force when carefully executed. The same scrutiny and caution apply today. Whether you're a politician, a CEO, or a small business owner, employing deception can be a high-reward but high-risk venture. Beyond the famous advice on deception, Machiavelli's broader message is that success often depends on one's ability to adapt to changing circumstances. He speaks of virtù and fortuna, terms that can be loosely translated as skill or capability, virtù, and luck or fortune, fortuna. The truly adept leader in Machiavelli's eyes uses virtù to handle the unpredictability of fortuna. Deception can be a part of one's virtù, an essential technique in the political or strategic toolkit. This approach calls for constant calculation and assessment. If a situation calls for openness, a leader should be open. If it calls for a show of force, the leader should not hesitate. But if a more cunning solution presents itself, why engage in an expensive fight? For Machiavelli, every political actor is always recalculating, reconsidering alliances, and repositioning themselves in the fluid environment of power politics. In modern terms, think of a startup navigating the competitive tech space. Sometimes it may need to form partnerships, sometimes it may need to pivot its product direction, and sometimes it may need to present a certain image to investors or customers that isn't entirely aligned with the raw truth of its internal struggles. That image shaping might be seen as a mild form of deception if it inflates success or conceals weaknesses. But from the startup's perspective, it might be absolutely necessary for survival and growth. Yet Machiavelli would remind the startup, don't rely on illusions if you can't maintain them in the long run. Eventually, you need a solid product, real clients, and genuine value. Deception might offer breathing room, but it's not a substitute for genuine strength and strategy. While most people only know Machiavelli through The Prince, it's worth noting that he wrote much more than that. In his Discourses on Livy, Machiavelli analyzes the Roman Republic and praises the virtues of republican governance. He notes the importance of checks and balances, civic virtue among citizens, and the dangers of corruption. This more extended work suggests that Machiavelli was not purely a promoter of tyranny. Instead, he had a genuine interest in the stability and prosperity of political entities, whether monarchic or republican. Machiavelli's letters and correspondence, too, reveal a more human side to him, sometimes lamenting Florence's political fate or offering frank observations about allies and enemies. These documents give us insight into his personal experiences and highlight the swirl of alliances and betrayals that defined Renaissance Italy. In many ways, Machiavelli was a product of his time, writing about real events in a very real environment where deception was commonplace and often expected. Despite living 5 centuries ago, Machiavelli's words strike a chord in our modern era. The context may have changed. World leaders engage in summits and negotiations that rely less on swords and more on economic and diplomatic maneuvers. But the fundamental human dynamics of power, ambition, fear, and trust remain the same: politics and elections. In democratic systems, a politician tries to shape public opinion through carefully orchestrated campaigns, strategic leaks, and focus group-tested speeches. Sometimes these maneuvers blur into the territory of deception or manipulation. Voters must remain vigilant, much like Machiavelli's people, to discern genuine policy intentions from mere rhetorical flourishes. Business and marketing. In the corporate realm, marketing campaigns can often present half-truths. A product might be glorified while any flaws or limitations are minimized. Investors might be misled about the state of a company's finances. These examples echo Machiavelli's counsel that a wise prince or CEO should know how to project a winning image, even if the reality is more complicated. Technology and warfare. With cyber warfare, the battlefront has shifted to digital arenas. Governments might hack each other's networks, influencing elections or stealing trade secrets. Again, a cunning plan, like a well-placed virus or misinformation campaign, can achieve more than an open military confrontation. It's often cheaper, less politically risky, and more subtle. Personal and social relationships. On a smaller scale, interpersonal relationships in the modern world can also reflect Machiavellian insights. While everyday friendships hopefully don't revolve around grand deceptions, there are times when social dynamics can reward those who carefully manage impressions, hold back certain truths, or present themselves in a strategic light. Now, in creating a video or any narrative around Machiavelli's famous maxim, it's crucial to maintain the audience's curiosity. People are inherently drawn to intrigue, secrets, and behind-the-scenes revelations. By highlighting historical anecdotes, from Hannibal's cunning to Operation Mincemeat, one can paint vivid pictures of how deception can tip the scales of power. We might imagine a montage where the viewer sees the Carthaginian army carefully luring Roman legions into a trap, then shifting to scenes of Bismarck orchestrating alliances in 19th century Europe, then jumping to the hush-hush headquarters of Allied command in World War II, forging fake invasion plans. The common thread is the theme of deception as a creative, often breathtaking alternative to direct aggression. Such stories naturally raise moral questions. As we watch leaders trick entire populations or fool their enemies, we can't help but wonder, is this fair? Is it ethical? Or is it simply the way the world works? Provoking these questions is part of what makes Machiavelli such an enduring figure. He doesn't provide clear moral comfort. Rather, he forces us to confront the fact that power and survival have their own rules. So how do we apply this lesson? Never attempt to win by force what can be won by deception, in our everyday lives without descending into manipulative or dishonest behavior. The essence might be better reframed as, always look for a subtle, intelligent solution before resorting to brute force. In other words, ask yourself, can diplomacy, negotiation, or creative thinking solve a conflict more efficiently than a direct confrontational showdown? In many personal or professional situations, an approach that prioritizes listening, empathy, and negotiation might resolve tensions without an all-out argument. You don't have to resort to lying or malicious trickery, but you can still be strategic. You can still ask, what is my best angle here? How can I present my case in a way that will resonate most with the other side? This is a form of winning by cunning if we interpret cunning to mean strategy and thoughtfulness rather than outright deceit. It's also worth noting that Machiavelli's perspective is not the only way. Great leaders throughout history have also found success by building genuine trust, fostering cooperation, and employing honesty as their main resource. Deception is powerful, but fragile, and once exposed, it can wreak havoc on one's reputation. The wise individual knows that cunning is just one arrow in the quiver of strategic thinking. As we wrap up this journey, let's circle back to the core idea. Machiavelli's Renaissance worldview resonates in our modern times. The line, "Never attempt to win by force what can be won by deception," has a timeless ring because it addresses a universal truth about human conflict and the pursuit of power. Force is costly. Deception, while ethically murky, can be more efficient and, if executed skillfully, less damaging to resources and lives. However, the deeper conversation Machiavelli provokes is about the nature of power and how it interacts with morality. Should we embrace cunning as a legitimate tool in governance, business, or personal relationships? Or should we strive to create a world where mutual respect, open dialogue, and collaboration prevail, making deception less necessary or even counterproductive? Machiavelli never claims that deception is virtuous or that brute force is always wrong. He simply warns us that a world full of scheming adversaries demands a strategic approach. History, from Hannibal's battles to World War II stratagems, underscores that cunning can indeed make the difference between victory and defeat. Equally, stories abound of cunning strategies that fell flat when unmasked, unleashing a terrible backlash. In our digital age where information travels at light speed and reputations can be built or shattered overnight, Machiavelli's counsel rings especially true, but also comes with new risks. One slip can expose a carefully crafted deception to a global audience. With that in mind, wise leaders might do well to reflect on whether the short-term advantage offered by deceit is worth the long-term ramifications of losing trust. Ultimately, Machiavelli's legacy invites us to engage in ongoing dialogue about the balance between ethics and pragmatism. It forces us to confront uncomfortable realities about human nature and the structures of power, and it challenges us to think carefully about when, if ever, deception might be justified, and when honesty and openness serve us better in the long run.